Ivy Hayes sat at the worn wooden table of her tiny apartment, the flickering glow of a street lamp casting uneven shadows against the walls. Bills stacked in neat but suffocating piles beside her, unopened, ignored, feared. The numbers printed on them weren't just figures. They were ticking time bombs. Rent was due. Medical school loans loomed. And yet, her last paycheck had barely stretched beyond groceries and gas. Her phone vibrated across the table, cutting through the thick silence. The caller ID was an unknown number. Ivy hesitated. Unknown numbers rarely brought good news. Collections, scams, desperate job offers with impossible hours. But right now, she was desperate too. She answered. "Hello?" A smooth, measured voice filled the receiver. "Is this Ivy Hayes?" She straightened. "Yes, speaking." "My name is Brooklyn Langford. I understand you're a nurse." A pause. "I have a proposition for you." Ivy frowned, gripping the phone tighter. Brooklyn Langford. The name rang a distant bell. Something about a wealthy family, old money, the kind of name whispered in elite Savannah circles. "I'm listening." "My husband, Lincoln Langford, is very ill." Terminal Brooklyn's voice was crisp, almost rehearsed. "We need someone to care for him in his final days. A private position, significant pay." Ivy's pulse kicked up. Private nursing positions were rare, and they always paid well. But something about Brooklyn's tone, too composed, too businesslike, made her wary. She took a breath. What exactly would this job entail? A beat of silence. Then, carefully, Brooklyn said, "He wants someone to spend time with him as his daughter." Ivy nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's what he's requested," Brooklyn said evenly. "One day, a full 24 hours. You play the role, he gets closure, and you walk away with $10,000. The number hit her like a cold wave. 10,000. For one day. Her mind raced. It didn't make sense. Who hired a stranger to play a daughter? But $10,000. That was nearly 3 months of rent. The difference between drowning and staying afloat. Brooklyn continued, sensing her hesitation. You wouldn't be expected to deceive him. He knows the truth. He simply wants the experience. Someone to talk to. Someone who won't treat him like an invalid. It's harmless. Harmless. Ivy wasn't sure she believed that, but the weight of her reality crushed her resistance. "When do you need me?" she asked. "Tomorrow, noon." Ivy exhaled. "Where?" Brooklyn gave her the address. Ivy recognized the location instantly. Langford Manor, one of the grandest estates in Savannah, a historic landmark that loomed over the city like a relic of untouchable wealth. The kind of place people whispered about, envied, but never truly understood. "Be on time," Brooklyn said. "And Ivy, discretion is expected." The line went dead before Ivy could respond. She set the phone down, staring at it, heartbeat thudding in her ears. This was insane. But insanity, for $10,000, was suddenly worth considering. The next day, she arrived at Langford Manor, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she took in the sight before her. The estate was magnificent. Pristine gardens, ivy-covered walls, the kind of southern grandeur that spoke of old money and long histories. But behind the beauty, Ivy sensed something else. A hollowness. A house that had witnessed too much loss. As she stepped out of her car, the heavy wooden doors creaked open. A man stood at the threshold, watching her. "You must be Ivy." His voice was deep, calm, and carried a weight that made her straighten involuntarily. "I am." She smoothed her blouse, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked against the backdrop of luxury. The man studied her, then nodded once. "I'm Hugo, Mr. Langford's butler." Of course, he had a butler. Hugo stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. The moment Ivy crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The interior of the house was breathtaking. Dark wood floors, towering bookshelves, grand chandeliers casting pools of golden light. And yet, despite its beauty, there was a stillness, a feeling of something unfinished. This way. Hugo led her through the house, past silent corridors, past doors that seemed to hold their own secrets. Finally, they reached a set of double doors. He turned to her. "Mr. Langford is expecting you." Ivy swallowed, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. Lincoln Langford sat in a grand armchair near the window, sunlight spilling onto his fragile frame. He was older than she'd expected, thin, pale, but with sharp eyes that pinned her in place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, he said, "You look just like her." A chill ran down Ivy's spine. "Like who?" Lincoln smiled faintly, but there was something unreadable in his expression. "My daughter, the one I lost." Ivy didn't know how to respond. She had assumed this would be an act. But there was something raw in his voice, something unpracticed. She hesitated, then carefully took the seat across from him. Lincoln exhaled. "Do you believe in second chances, Ivy?" She blinked at the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose it depends." His lips curled slightly, as if that answer amused him. "Then let's find out together." Ivy shifted uncomfortably in the grand armchair, her hands pressed against her lap as Lincoln Langford studied her. His gaze was penetrating, though not unkind, as if he were searching for something just beyond her face, something invisible to her, but unmistakable to him. "You don't have to look so uneasy," he murmured. "I don't bite." Ivy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, forcing a small smile. "I guess I just don't know what's expected of me." Lincoln leaned back slightly, his frail fingers tracing the armrest. "Just sit. Talk. Humor an old man." Something about the way he said it made her hesitate. There was loneliness woven into his voice, something deeper than mere nostalgia. She nodded, deciding to go along with it. After all, $10,000 wasn't something she could afford to turn down. "All right," she said, shifting in her seat. "What do you want to talk about?" Lincoln exhaled, his lips curving just slightly. "Tell me about yourself." Ivy hesitated. She hadn't expected that. She thought this arrangement would be the other way around. Him talking, her listening, nodding at all the right moments. She was here to play a part, not to reveal herself. "There's not much to tell," she said finally, keeping her voice light. "I'm a nurse. I work too much. I drink too much coffee. That's about it." Lincoln let out a quiet chuckle, though it was weak, more breath than sound. "And yet, I get the feeling there's more." Before she could answer, the door creaked open and Brooklyn Langford strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The air seemed to change the moment she entered, thickening, as if the house itself recognized her presence, and tensed in response. "Ivy," Brooklyn said, her lips forming a practiced smile, though her eyes held no warmth. "I trust you've made yourself comfortable." Ivy straightened. "Yes. Mr. Langford has been very welcoming." Brooklyn's gaze flickered towards Lincoln, a trace of impatience behind her otherwise polished exterior. "Darling, you should be resting." Lincoln's expression barely changed, but Ivy sensed the shift in his demeanor. If there had been a hint of warmth in his interaction with her, it was gone now, replaced with something guarded. "I'll rest when I feel like it," he said flatly. Brooklyn's smile tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned back to Ivy. "Hugo will be showing you to your room. It's best you get settled in." Ivy frowned. "I thought I was only here for the day." Brooklyn tilted her head, feigning amusement. "Things change. We may need you longer." Ivy's stomach twisted. Something about the way Brooklyn said it made her uneasy. She glanced at Lincoln, but he was staring out the window now, his thoughts elsewhere. "Of course," Ivy said carefully. "I appreciate the accommodations." Brooklyn gave a small nod, then turned on her heel and left the room, her presence leaving behind an odd, almost suffocating emptiness. Ivy swallowed. The tension in the air remained. "She doesn't like me," Ivy murmured. Lincoln let out a dry chuckle. "She doesn't like anyone she can't control." That sent a flicker of something through Ivy's chest. A warning. A confirmation of the strange undercurrent she'd felt since stepping into this house. Either way, she wasn't sure what to make of it. Before she could ask more, the door opened again, this time to Hugo, standing tall, his hands neatly folded in front of him. "If you'll follow me, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice deep and steady. Ivy nodded, standing and casting one last glance at Lincoln. He was watching her, a quiet intensity in his eyes. "Thank you," he said. And though the words were simple, they held weight, as if, in some way, he meant more than just gratitude for her presence. Ivy followed Hugo down the long corridor, her shoes tapping against the polished wood floors. The walls were lined with portraits, their gilded frames gleaming under the soft glow of antique sconces. It was a home drenched in history, in secrets. "You've worked here a long time?" Ivy asked, breaking the silence. Hugo nodded. "Over 30 years. She hesitated. "Do you like it?" There was a pause before he answered. "It is a place of great privilege." He turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And great burdens." Ivy felt a chill. What kind of burdens? Hugo stopped at the door to her room, his hand on the knob. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You'll see." And with that, he pushed open the door. The room was beautiful, too beautiful for a temporary guest. Large windows framed the garden, and a canopy bed sat in the center, draped in silk. A room meant for someone important. Not a nurse hired for a day. Ivy stepped inside slowly, her fingers brushing over the wooden vanity, the cool glass of a framed photograph resting atop it. She lifted it carefully, her breath catching. A little girl. Dark hair, laughing, held in the arms of a much younger Lincoln Langford. A daughter, her stomach knotted. This wasn't just an arrangement. This wasn't just about closure. There was something else at play, a story still unfinished, and somehow she was part of it now. Ivy traced her finger over the glass frame, her eyes locked onto the image of the little girl clinging to Lincoln Langford's younger self. The child's laughter was frozen in time, her eyes alight with a joy that felt foreign in this house. The photo was old, edges slightly worn, as if handled too many times, or maybe not enough. A knock at the door jolted her. She set the frame down carefully, straightening just as Hugo stepped inside. His presence filled the room in a quiet, authoritative way, his gaze sweeping over her expression before landing on the photograph she had barely released. "You found her," he murmured. Ivy turned slowly. "Who is she?" Hugo hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping further inside, the weight of an unspoken truth resting on his shoulders. "That is Rose Langford." His voice was careful, deliberate. "Mr. Langford's daughter." Ivy felt a chill. She already knew, but hearing it aloud solidified something heavy in her chest. What happened to her? A pause. Hugo's jaw tightened. "She passed away, a long time ago." Ivy's stomach twisted. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier with something unspoken. She wanted to ask how, when, but something about Hugo's stance, the way his hands folded behind his back, told her the subject was not meant to be pried open so easily. She swallowed. And now he's hiring strangers to fill that space. Hugo's expression barely flickered. He is a man burdened with regret. People deal with loss in different ways. Ivy exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She wasn't sure why it bothered her so much. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation, or maybe it was the quiet, aching grief that seemed to permeate every corner of this house. Hugo shifted slightly, his gaze assessing her. "You should come downstairs. Dinner will be served shortly." Ivy hesitated. Dinner? She hadn't expected to stay long enough for formal meals. Hugo nodded. Mr. Langford insisted. Ivy glanced back at the photograph one last time before following him out. The dining room was breathtaking. A long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, adorned with silver candle holders and fine china. At the head of the table, Lincoln sat, his frame small against the grand chair, though his presence commanded attention. Across from him, Brooklyn swirled the wine in her glass, barely looking up as Ivy entered. Lincoln's eyes warmed slightly at the sight of her. "You came?" "I didn't realize I had a choice," Ivy murmured, taking the seat Hugo gestured toward. Brooklyn let out a quiet laugh, though it was devoid of humor. "Charming." Lincoln ignored her, turning his attention back to Ivy. "Tell me, do you always accept unusual job offers?" Ivy arched a brow. "Do you always hire people to pretend to be your family?" His lips twitched slightly. "Touché." Hugo poured wine into her glass, and she noted how practiced his movements were, how carefully everything was placed. The entire house functioned like a delicate, orchestrated dance, everything in its place, everyone knowing their roles, except her. Brooklyn leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze settling on Ivy. "Tell me, Ivy, do you often find yourself in desperate situations?" Ivy stiffened. "Excuse me." Brooklyn took a slow sip of her wine, her red lips curving. "I assume $10,000 was incentive enough for you to overlook how absurd this arrangement is." Ivy's jaw clenched. She could feel the condescension woven into Brooklyn's words, the subtle dig. She didn't belong here, and Brooklyn wanted to make sure she never forgot that. Lincoln set his fork down, his voice cutting through the tension. "That's enough, Brooklyn." Brooklyn didn't even flinch. "I'm merely making conversation." Lincoln's gaze darkened slightly, but his voice remained measured. "If you can't behave with respect, I suggest you excuse yourself." Brooklyn held his stare for a moment, before exhaling lightly, as if barely inconvenienced, and rose from her chair. She placed her napkin neatly on the table, flashing Ivy a cool smile. "I'll leave you two to your bonding." She disappeared down the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking until they faded entirely. Ivy let out a slow breath. She doesn't seem thrilled about this arrangement. Lincoln's lips quirked slightly, but there was something weary behind it. Brooklyn is accustomed to control. She doesn't take well to surprises. "Neither do I," Ivy admitted. Lincoln tilted his head slightly, studying her in that quiet, observant way he had. "Then I imagine you and I have that in common." Ivy wasn't sure how to respond to that. She picked at the food on her plate, trying to make sense of the man before her. He was wealthy beyond comprehension, powerful enough to have the world at his feet, and yet, he looked like someone who had lost everything that truly mattered. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Of all people, why hire me?" Lincoln was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his wineglass. "You remind me of someone." Ivy's throat tightened, rose. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Yes." Ivy leaned back slightly, exhaling. "That's a lot of pressure." "I don't expect you to be her," Lincoln said simply. "I just don't want to leave this world feeling as if I never tried." She frowned. "Tried what?" He held her gaze. "To make things right." A chill ran down her spine. There was more to this, more than he was saying. But before she could push further, Hugo stepped back into the room, his voice low and measured. "Dr. Preston has arrived." Ivy turned her head just as Dr. Owen Preston stepped into the dining room. He was well dressed with a neatly pressed blazer and a gaze that moved swiftly over the room before landing on Lincoln. "How are we feeling tonight?" Owen asked, his voice smooth. Lincoln exhaled. "Old," Owen smirked. "Not much I can do about that." Ivy watched as Owen moved closer, setting a black leather medical bag on the table. There was an ease to him, something practiced, though Ivy caught the way his fingers hesitated slightly before reaching for Lincoln's wrist. She frowned. Doctors didn't hesitate, not ones who had been treating patients for years. Lincoln gave her a small, knowing look, as if he had caught her observation. Owen glanced at her. "I take it you're the new nurse?" Ivy met his gaze. "For now." Owen gave a small nod, but his eyes held something unreadable. "Then I suppose we'll be seeing more of each other." There was something about the way he said it that made her stomach twist. She had a feeling this arrangement was about to get far more complicated. Ivy watched as Dr. Owen Preston carefully checked Lincoln's pulse, his fingers pressing lightly against the older man's wrist. The dining room had grown eerily silent, save for the distant ticking of an antique clock on the far wall. Lincoln, for his part, remained still, his gaze unreadable as he allowed Owen to do his work. The doctor's jaw was set, his movements measured, but Ivy caught the way his brow furrowed just slightly, the kind of micro-expression that most wouldn't notice. But she did. Something wasn't right. She leaned forward. "How's his heart rate?" Owen didn't look at her. "Stable enough." It wasn't an answer, not really. Lincoln's lips curled faintly, but there was something behind it, something sharp, like a blade carefully tucked beneath silk. "You always were good at dodging direct questions, Owen." Owen sighed, withdrawing his hands. "You always were good at pretending you wanted the truth." A flicker of something passed between them. Familiarity, old resentment. Ivy could feel it in the air, heavy and unspoken. Owen turned to her, his expression smooth again. "Since you're the new nurse, I assume you'll be assisting me with his care." Ivy lifted her chin slightly. "If that's what's needed." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Brooklyn didn't mention you had medical experience." Brooklyn didn't ask. Owen smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "She doesn't like surprises." "No," Ivy said, keeping her voice even. "She doesn't." Lincoln exhaled. "You two can dance around each other's words all night, but if you're done poking at me, Owen, I'd like to enjoy my evening." Owen glanced at his watch, seemingly unfazed. "I'll adjust your medication dosage and check in tomorrow morning." Ivy's stomach twisted. Dosage, medication. She didn't trust it. Not the way Owen had hesitated earlier, not the way Brooklyn had been so eager to rush the will signing. Something in her gut told her that Lincoln's decline wasn't as natural as it seemed. Owen packed up his bag and gave her a slight nod. "I'm sure I'll see you around." Ivy didn't respond, just watched as he left the room, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway. Lincoln leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest, his expression thoughtful. "He doesn't like you." Ivy blinked. "I got that." Lincoln chuckled softly, though it was weak. "You ask too many questions." She tilted her head. "Do you want me to stop?" For the first time since she'd arrived, something flickered across his face. A pause. The kind of hesitation that meant he wasn't sure if he wanted to answer honestly, or lie. Finally he sighed. "No." That was all she needed to know. Later that night, Ivy stood by the large bay window in her room, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. The estate was bathed in the soft glow of the moon, casting long shadows over the hedges and fountains. It was beautiful, eerily so, but beautiful things could be dangerous. A soft knock at her door made her turn. Hugo stepped inside, his posture as composed as ever. "I thought you might like some tea before bed." She smiled slightly. "You don't have to do that. I insist." He placed the tray on the small table by the window, then hesitated just slightly. "How are you finding your stay so far?" Ivy let out a slow breath. "It's complicated." Hugo's lips twitched, a ghost of amusement. "That's one way to describe the Langfords." She studied him for a moment. "You've been here a long time." "I have." She bit her lip, debating whether she should push further, but curiosity won out. "Why does it feel like everyone is keeping secrets?" Hugo was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Because they are." The admission sent a ripple of unease through her. Hugo sighed, his voice quieter now. "Mr. Langford is a good man, but good men are not always honest men." Ivy swallowed. "About what?" Hugo's eyes softened slightly, as if he saw more than she was saying. "Some questions don't have easy answers, Miss Hayes." Frustration prickled at her. "Then give me a hard one." Hugo exhaled, shaking his head. "You should get some rest." It wasn't an answer. Not really. But before she could push, Hugo was already walking toward the door. He paused before leaving, glancing back at her one last time. "Be careful, Miss Hayes." Then he was gone. Ivy stared at the closed door, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. "Be careful." She turned back toward the window, staring out at the darkness. Something wasn't right in this house, and she was going to find out what. The Langford estate was eerily silent at night, the kind of silence that made Ivy's skin prickle, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She lay awake in the massive canopy bed, staring at the intricate patterns carved into the ceiling, her mind tangled in a web of unanswered questions. Something was wrong here. She had felt it the moment she stepped inside, but now it was pressing in on her, refusing to be ignored. Hugo's warning, Lincoln's cryptic words, Owen's hesitation, pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet fit together. Ivy exhaled, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Sleep wasn't coming anytime soon. Maybe a walk would clear her head. She pulled on the robe draped over the chair and stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. The house was different at night. Shadows stretched unnaturally, the antique sconces flickering as she moved past them. The polished floors whispered beneath her bare feet as she descended the grand staircase. As she reached the bottom, a voice drifted through the silence. "You shouldn't be wandering." Ivy turned sharply. Owen stood near the doorway to Lincoln's study, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. He was still dressed, sleeves rolled up as if he hadn't planned to sleep either. "I couldn't," she admitted. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Too much on your mind?" Ivy crossed her arms. "Shouldn't you be home by now?" Owen smirked, leaning against the doorway. "I keep odd hours." She studied him carefully. There was something about Owen that set her on edge. Not in the way Brooklyn did, with her carefully placed words and calculating presence, but in a way that made her feel like she was standing too close to something dangerous, not threatening, just unpredictable. "You don't trust me," Owen said, watching her too closely. Ivy didn't flinch. "Should I?" He let out a soft chuckle. "Smart." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you going to tell me what's really wrong with Lincoln?" His expression barely changed, but she saw it, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders straightened. "He's dying," Owen said simply. "That's all you need to know." Ivy took a step closer. "But why does it feel like you're not telling me everything?" Owen sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Because it's not my story to tell." Frustration flickered through her. Another half answer, another secret buried beneath polished words. "You're just like Hugo," she muttered. Owen's lips twitched. "That's a first." Ivy shook her head, exhaling. "I don't like feeling like I'm in the dark." Owen studied her for a moment, then pushed off the doorway. "Then maybe you're in the wrong house." He walked past her, heading toward the entrance hall, and Ivy turned to watch him go. "Do you work for Lincoln?" she asked suddenly. Owen paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "I work for whoever pays me." It wasn't the answer she was looking for. She let him go, watching as he disappeared down the hall. A chill ran down her spine. She had the distinct feeling that Owen Preston was a man with too many loyalties. And none of them were to her. The next morning, Ivy found Lincoln in the sunroom, seated in a plush armchair, a blanket draped over his legs. The morning light streamed through the towering windows, casting a soft glow over the room. "You look like a woman with questions," Lincoln said, before she even spoke. Ivy folded her arms. "Maybe because I am." He smirked. "You're not afraid to challenge me. I like that." "I just want the truth," she said carefully. "I need to understand what's really happening here." Lincoln's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw it. Exhaustion, not just in his body, but in his soul. "I made mistakes," he admitted quietly. "Mistakes that I can't undo." Ivy swallowed. "Like losing your daughter?" A shadow crossed his face. "Yeah." She hesitated. "How did she—" Lincoln's jaw tightened. "That's not something I talk about." She nodded slowly. "And Daniel?" Lincoln's entire body stilled. It was confirmation enough. Ivy exhaled. "He's real, isn't he?" Lincoln's fingers gripped the blanket. "You're persistent." "I need to be." He sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. "Yes," he admitted finally. "He's real." Ivy's heart pounded. "Why isn't he here?" Lincoln looked at her then, his gaze heavy. "Because I failed him too." The weight of his words settled between them. Ivy inhaled slowly. "And now you want a second chance?" Lincoln's lips pressed together, his throat working as he swallowed. "I don't know if I deserve one." She softened. For all his wealth, all his power, Lincoln Langford was a man haunted by his past. And that kind of regret didn't just fade. It lingered, settled deep in the bones, a reminder of everything lost. "You can't fix the past," she said gently, "but maybe you can change the ending." Lincoln met her gaze, something flickering in his tired eyes. Hope. And just like that, Ivy realized, this wasn't just about pretending to be his daughter. This was about helping him find the one he lost, the real one. The morning air was thick with the scent of magnolias, their soft fragrance drifting through the open balcony doors of the sunroom. Ivy sat across from Lincoln, the weight of their previous conversation still settling between them. Daniel Langford was real. The thought pulsed in her mind, threading through every observation she had made since arriving at the estate. Lincoln's guilt, the secrecy, the way Brooklyn hovered, watching, waiting. The puzzle pieces were starting to align, but the picture they formed was still frustratingly incomplete. Lincoln had stopped speaking after his admission, his gaze lost somewhere in the rolling gardens outside. For a man who had built an empire, controlled the lives of many, it was strange to see him here, helpless in the one thing he wanted most. "You don't have to tell me everything," Ivy said finally, breaking the silence. "But if you want a second chance, you're going to have to do more than sit here waiting for it to come to you." Lincoln let out a quiet, almost bitter chuckle. "And what would you have me do, Ivy?" "Walk out of this house and track down a son who probably wants nothing to do with me." Ivy leaned forward. "You don't know that." Lincoln's fingers curled against the armrest of his chair, his knuckles paling. "I abandoned him." His voice was rough, thick with something she couldn't quite place. "Do you know what that does to a child?" Ivy inhaled sharply, her heart knocking against her ribs. "Yes," she said softly. "I do." Lincoln's gaze snapped to hers. There was no pity in his expression, only understanding. Maybe he had suspected. Maybe he had seen the way she held herself, the way she never spoke of her own family. But he didn't press, and Ivy was grateful for that. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his temple. I don't even know where he is. That was something she could fix. She stood, smoothing out the fabric of her blouse. Then let's find him. Lincoln blinked. Just like that? Yes, she said firmly. Just like that. He let out a slow breath, something between disbelief and amusement. You're impossible. And you're out of options, she shot back. Lincoln smirked, but there was something grateful in the expression. All right, Ivy Hayes. Where do we start? Before she could answer, the doors to the sunroom opened and Brooklyn stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood. She took in the scene before her, her gaze flickering between them, unreadable as always. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, she said smoothly. Lincoln didn't move. What do you want, Brooklyn? Brooklyn smiled, but it was sharp, practiced. Dr. Preston is here. Ivy glanced at Lincoln, but his face had already closed off again. His earlier vulnerability sealed away beneath the carefully composed mask he had perfected over the years. Brooklyn's gaze settled on Ivy. Perhaps you should give them privacy. Ivy met her eyes, unflinching. I'd rather stay. Brooklyn arched a brow, amused. How loyal you are. It's almost touching. Before Ivy could respond, Owen stepped into the room, his expression neutral, but his eyes sweeping over Lincoln with an assessing gaze. He carried his black medical bag, the leather worn from years of use. Lincoln, Owen greeted, nodding slightly. How are you feeling today? Lincoln exhaled. Old. Owen smirked. You were old yesterday. That's not exactly a change. Lincoln rolled his eyes, but Ivy noticed something in Owen's demeanor. Something casual on the surface, but tight beneath. Owen set his bag down on the table beside them, unzipping it with precise movements. He pulled out a small pill bottle, checking the label before shaking out 2 tablets. New dosage, Owen said, handing them over. Lincoln took them without hesitation, swallowing them with a sip of water. Ivy narrowed her eyes. What's the change in dosage for? Owen turned his gaze on her, his expression unreadable. Just adjustments based on his vitals. It was an answer, but not a satisfying one. Did you run any new tests? Ivy asked, folding her arms. Owen tilted his head slightly. Are you questioning my treatment, Ivy? Brooklyn let out a quiet laugh. She does that. Ivy ignored her. I'm just asking for clarification. Owen's smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. I'd be happy to go over the details if you have a medical degree I should be aware of. Ivy held his gaze. I have common sense. Something flickered across Owen's face, just for a second, but it was gone before she could analyze it. Lincoln sighed, rubbing his temple. Can we not do this? Brooklyn placed a hand on Owen's arm, a gesture that was too familiar, too rehearsed. Dr. Preston has been Lincoln's physician for years. There's no need to play detective, Ivy. Ivy clenched her jaw but forced herself to nod. She'd pick her battles, for now. Owen packed up his bag and straightened. I'll be back tomorrow. Brooklyn smiled. Always a pleasure. Owen's gaze flickered to Ivy one last time before he turned and left the room. As soon as he was gone, Ivy exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Brooklyn watched her with something dangerously close to amusement. You're very protective, aren't you? Ivy looked at her. Someone has to be. Brooklyn's smile was slow, knowing. How sweet. She turned her gaze back to Lincoln. Try not to exhaust yourself. Then she was gone, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Lincoln let out a long breath. She enjoys making people uncomfortable. Ivy shook her head, sitting back down. She enjoys control. Lincoln smirked. Same thing. Ivy looked at him. Do you trust Owen? Lincoln was silent for a moment, then shrugged. I trust that he does what he's paid to do. That wasn't an answer. Not really. Ivy leaned back, her mind racing. She didn't know what Owen's role was in all of this, but one thing was certain. Brooklyn wasn't the only person in this house with an agenda. Ivy sat on the edge of the ornate fountain in the Langford garden, the gentle trickle of water behind her, doing little to ease the storm in her mind. The morning sun filtered through the towering oaks, casting shifting patterns over the stone pathways. She had thought coming outside would clear her head, but the estate's beauty only made the tension in her chest feel sharper, more pronounced. Something was wrong in this house. Brooklyn was playing a game. Owen was keeping secrets, and Lincoln, he was slipping further into his regrets, clinging to her presence as if she could somehow rewrite the past for him. She sighed, rubbing her temples. The weight of it all was pressing down on her, and she hadn't even been here that long. Deep thoughts. Ivy startled at the voice and turned to see Owen stepping down the stone steps leading from the house. He was dressed more casually today, no stiff blazer, just a crisp button-down with the sleeves rolled up. She exhaled slowly, composing herself. Something like that. Owen smirked, stepping closer. I don't peg you as the type to sit around contemplating life. Ivy arched a brow. And what type do you think I am? He tilted his head, watching her with an amusement that felt entirely too self-assured. The kind who keeps asking questions even when she knows she won't like the answers. She folded her arms. Maybe I just like the truth. Or maybe you just don't trust people, he countered. Ivy narrowed her eyes. Should I? Owen let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. That depends on what you think is being hidden. There it was again. That careful, measured way he spoke. Never confirming, never denying. Just circling the conversation, making her feel like she was being led somewhere, rather than finding her own way. She studied him. You know what's happening in this house, don't you? Owen's smirk didn't waver, but something in his posture shifted. I know a lot of things. Like why Lincoln's health is deteriorating so quickly. His jaw tightened, just barely, but Ivy caught it. She pressed. You're changing his medication. Why? Owen's gaze darkened slightly. Because I'm his doctor. That's not an answer. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Ivy shook her head. I don't. For a moment they just stood there, the morning breeze stirring between them, carrying the scent of fresh jasmine. The air between them was charged, tense, but not hostile. There was something else there too, something unspoken. Owen exhaled, his voice softer this time. Ivy, Lincoln is sick. His body is failing him, whether you want to accept that or not. She held his gaze. And you're making it worse. Owen's lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak right away. That silence, just long enough to confirm what she feared. Her stomach twisted. I knew it. Owen looked away briefly, his jaw locking. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is, she challenged. He hesitated. That was all the confirmation she needed. Ivy stepped back, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. You're supposed to help him. Owen exhaled, his frustration evident. You think this is simple, that this is just black and white. His voice dropped slightly, his tone edged with something deeper. There are things at play here that you don't understand. Ivy clenched her jaw. Then help me understand. Owen stared at her for a long moment. Then, finally he said, Lincoln doesn't have much time left. Ivy's breath caught. Owen's voice was steady, but there was something almost conflicted in it. I can slow it down. I can make it comfortable, but I can't stop it. Ivy swallowed the lump in her throat. Then why does it feel like you're speeding it up? Owen flinched, just slightly. Ivy pressed on. Is it Brooklyn? Is she making you do this? Owen exhaled sharply, looking away. You ask too many questions. You give too few answers. Another silence stretched between them, but this one was different. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was something heavier, a truth neither of them wanted to speak aloud. Finally, Owen shook his head. Be careful, Ivy. Ivy frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He turned to walk away, but then hesitated, glancing back at her. His voice was quieter this time, less guarded. You're not the only one trying to protect him. Then he left. Ivy stood there, heart pounding, the weight of his words sinking into her bones. If Owen was trying to protect Lincoln, then what exactly was Brooklyn trying to do? Ivy paced the length of her room, her mind racing with everything Owen had said and everything he hadn't. You're not the only one trying to protect him. The words had replayed in her head all day, curling around every doubt, every suspicion, weaving together a truth she hadn't quite grasped yet. Owen wasn't the enemy. Brooklyn was. And yet, something about Owen still felt off. He was keeping things from her, withholding just enough information to keep her searching, but not enough to give her clarity. Ivy exhaled sharply, turning toward the window. The Langford estate stretched out before her, bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun. From here, she could see the perfectly manicured gardens, the stone pathways that led to the back terrace where Lincoln often sat. And then there was Brooklyn, standing near the fountain, talking to someone Ivy couldn't quite make out. Ivy leaned in, squinting slightly. Brooklyn's posture was sharp, her hands moving in quick, clipped gestures. Whoever she was speaking to remained mostly still, nodding occasionally. Then, as if sensing she was being watched, Brooklyn suddenly turned her head, her gaze lifting directly toward Ivy's window. Ivy jerked back instinctively, heart hammering. Had she seen her? Ivy waited, breath held. Seconds passed. Then, Brooklyn simply turned back to her conversation, as if nothing had happened. Ivy released a slow breath, forcing herself to step away from the window. This house was starting to feel smaller by the second, the walls pressing in, the secrets thick in the air. She needed answers. Without thinking, she grabbed her cardigan and slipped into the hallway. The house was quiet, the lingering hush of afternoon lull settling over the halls. She moved quickly, her footsteps careful as she made her way toward Lincoln's study. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for. A clue, a document, something, anything, that might tell her what Brooklyn was planning. She reached the door and pressed her hand to the brass handle. It turned easily, and the door creaked open. Lincoln wasn't inside. The room smelled faintly of old books and bourbon, the wooden desk in the center of the room stacked neatly with papers. His chair was positioned near the window, where the sheer curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze. Ivy stepped inside, scanning the room. It was organized, too organized. She moved toward the desk, fingers brushing over the smooth surface, scanning the papers. Medical records, legal documents, some financial paperwork she didn't understand. Then, a name. Her breath caught. Daniel Langford. She grabbed the paper, her eyes darting across the page. It wasn't much, just an old address, some outdated financial information. But it was proof. Proof that Lincoln had been searching for him. She swallowed hard, fingers gripping the paper tightly. Then the sound of footsteps. Ivy turned sharply, shoving the paper into her pocket just as the door creaked open. Brooklyn. She stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her expression unreadable. Ivy forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression neutral. Looking for something? Brooklyn asked, her tone smooth. Ivy lifted her chin slightly. Just checking on Lincoln. Brooklyn's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. He's resting. Ivy nodded, stepping away from the desk. Then I'll come back later. Brooklyn didn't move. Instead, she let her gaze drift around the room, taking in the slight shift in the papers on the desk, the barely disturbed atmosphere Ivy had left behind. "You're awfully interested in things that don't concern you," Brooklyn murmured. Ivy met her gaze. "I care about Lincoln." Brooklyn tilted her head slightly, studying her. "That's sweet. But let me give you a piece of advice, Ivy." She stepped closer, her voice dipping just slightly. "Don't get comfortable, because when this is all over, you'll be gone." Ivy's stomach twisted, but she didn't flinch. Brooklyn smiled, slow and knowing, then turned and walked out, leaving Ivy standing in the study, her heart pounding. She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing against the paper with Daniel's name. Brooklyn wanted her gone, which meant Ivy was getting close. Ivy moved through the hallways of Langford Manor with measured steps, her fingers curling around the paper in her pocket. The name Daniel Langford felt like a secret she wasn't meant to hold, a thread to a story that had been deliberately cut away from the fabric of this house. But now she had it, and Brooklyn knew she was getting too close. She exhaled slowly, keeping her face neutral as she descended the grand staircase. The golden light of the afternoon filtered in through the tall windows, illuminating the pristine estate in a way that felt almost mocking. This place was built on a legacy, one that Lincoln had buried, one that Brooklyn was determined to protect, and one that Ivy was slowly unraveling. As she reached the foyer, she spotted Hugo standing near the entrance to the parlor, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His eyes met hers, and though his expression remained composed, there was something watchful beneath it. "Miss Hayes," he said, nodding. "Hugo," she returned, careful. "Mr. Langford is asking for you." Ivy hesitated. Lincoln rarely requested her presence outright. Usually their conversations were unspoken invitations, moments of quiet understanding where he would start speaking and she would stay to listen. But this was different. She nodded. "I'll go to him now." Hugo's gaze lingered for a second longer before he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Ivy found Lincoln in the sunroom, seated in his usual chair by the open French doors. The warm breeze stirred the light curtains, carrying the faint scent of jasmine through the room. He looked tired, more so than usual. His fingers traced the rim of his glass, filled with amber liquid that he hadn't touched. She hesitated in the doorway. "You asked for me?" Lincoln looked up, and for a moment, the edges of his expression softened. "Ivy, sit." She did, carefully lowering herself onto the chair across from him. He studied her, his sharp gaze moving over her face, as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Finally, he exhaled. "You remind me of someone." Ivy stiffened, but kept her voice steady. "Rose." Lincoln let out a small, humorless chuckle. "No." He swirled the drink in his hand absently, watching the way the light caught the liquid. "You remind me of myself." She frowned. "I don't follow." Lincoln leaned back, draping an arm over the side of the chair. "I see the way you look at things. You don't just accept what's in front of you. You question it. You challenge it. You don't stop until you get the answers you're looking for." Ivy's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression even. "And that's a bad thing." "Not bad," he murmured. "Dangerous." Her throat tightened. "Are you saying I should stop asking questions?" Lincoln studied her for a long moment. "I'm saying you should be careful where you look for answers." The warning in his voice was subtle, but it was there. Ivy hesitated, then carefully reached into her pocket and slid out the paper with Daniel Langford's name. She placed it on the table between them. "I found this," she said, watching his reaction closely. "You've been looking for him." Lincoln didn't move. For a moment, she wasn't even sure he was breathing. Then, slowly, his fingers stretched forward, brushing the edge of the paper before he picked it up. He stared at the name, the tension in his jaw tightening. Finally, he exhaled. So, you know. Ivy leaned forward. Why didn't you tell me? Lincoln's grip on the paper tightened. Because I don't deserve to. The weight of his words settled between them. Ivy's chest ached, but she kept her voice steady. You still have time. Lincoln let out a slow, tired breath. Time, he murmured. Funny thing, isn't it? We think we have so much of it, until we don't. Ivy swallowed. If you don't reach out to him now, you never will. Lincoln finally met her gaze, something raw and uncertain flickering beneath his usual composure. And if he doesn't want to see me? Ivy didn't hesitate. Then at least you tried. The room went silent. The only sound was the rustling of the curtains and the distant chirping of birds in the garden. Then, Lincoln did something Ivy didn't expect. He folded the paper and slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Ivy's breath caught. Lincoln, I'll think about it, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Before she could press further, a slow clap echoed from the doorway. Ivy turned sharply, her stomach twisting at the sight of Brooklyn standing there. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. How touching, Brooklyn mused, stepping forward. A beautiful moment of self-discovery. Lincoln's face darkened. Not now, Brooklyn. Brooklyn ignored him, her gaze settling on Ivy. You've been busy, haven't you? Ivy met her stare, refusing to look away. Just doing my job. Brooklyn let out a quiet hum. I think you've forgotten what your job actually is. Lincoln's voice was sharp. Brooklyn. Brooklyn didn't acknowledge him. She stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on the back of Ivy's chair. I warned you once, Brooklyn murmured, just low enough that Lincoln wouldn't hear. You don't belong here. Ivy clenched her jaw but kept her expression smooth. Brooklyn smiled, her nails tapping against the wood. Let's see how long you last. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her presence lingering even after she was gone. Ivy exhaled slowly, forcing her shoulders to relax. Lincoln watched her carefully. You should be careful with her. Ivy swallowed the lump in her throat. I'm more worried about you. Lincoln gave her a small, tired smile. That makes two of us. But Ivy wasn't just worried anymore. She was certain. Brooklyn was hiding something, and Ivy was going to find out what. Ivy didn't leave the sunroom right away. Even after Brooklyn's footsteps had faded down the hall. Even after Lincoln had closed his eyes. Exhausted, she remained in her chair, her mind churning. Brooklyn wasn't just protecting something. She was hiding something. And whatever it was, it had everything to do with Daniel Langford. Ivy's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. She had pushed Lincoln as far as she could for now, but he wasn't the one she needed to confront next. Owen knew something. He had practically admitted as much. And if he wasn't directly involved in whatever Brooklyn was doing, then he was at least aware of it. She needed answers. Ivy rose from her chair and made her way back inside the house, her footsteps silent on the marble floors. She knew where Owen would be. Every afternoon he checked Lincoln's vitals, adjusting his prescriptions and making notes that Ivy wasn't allowed to see. The medical records were kept under lock and key, something Hugo had casually mentioned when she first arrived, but Ivy hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, though, now it felt like the key to everything. She reached Owen's makeshift office, a smaller study just off the east wing, and pushed open the door without knocking. Owen was behind his desk, flipping through a leather-bound journal, but he didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, his lips curved slightly, as if he had been expecting this. You really don't believe in knocking, do you? He mused. Ivy shut the door behind her, crossing her arms. Not when I know you'll just avoid my questions. Owen sighed, closing the journal and setting it aside. What is it now? Ivy stepped forward, lowering her voice. Lincoln has a son, Daniel. You knew, didn't you? Something flickered in Owen's gaze, but he didn't deny it. It wasn't my place to tell you. Ivy let out a sharp breath. But it was your place to help Brooklyn keep it quiet. Owen sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. You're walking a dangerous line, Ivy. I don't care. She leaned forward, her voice low but firm. Lincoln wants to find him. But Brooklyn, she doesn't just want to keep them apart. She wants me gone because I found out. Owen studied her carefully. That doesn't surprise me. Ivy's stomach tightened. Then tell me why. Owen exhaled, standing up slowly, resting his hands on the desk. Because if Daniel comes back, Brooklyn loses everything. Ivy frowned. What do you mean? Owen's gaze was sharp. Think about it. Lincoln is running out of time. His will, his estate, his fortune. It's all tied to what happens after he's gone. And right now, Brooklyn is the only name on the inheritance. Ivy's breath caught. Of course, Brooklyn wasn't just keeping secrets, she was securing her future. She's been trying to get Lincoln to sign everything over to her, Ivy murmured. Owen nodded, and so far he's refused. But if he knew his son was out there, alive, he'd change everything, Ivy finished. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Ivy swallowed, her heart pounding. You said you were trying to protect Lincoln. I am, Owen said evenly, but you're also protecting Brooklyn. Owen let out a slow breath. I'm keeping things from falling apart. Ivy shook her head. Number. You're helping her keep him in the dark. You're feeding him medication, adjusting his dosages, making sure he's just lucid enough to function, but never enough to fight. Owen's expression darkened. Be careful, Ivy. Or what? She challenged. You'll have Hugo escort me out. Or maybe Brooklyn will do something worse. Owen's jaw clenched. Brooklyn isn't someone you want to provoke. Ivy stepped closer. Neither am I. For the first time, Owen hesitated. A flicker of something in his gaze. Reluctance? Guilt? It was gone before she could place it. Ivy exhaled. You can't stand there and pretend you don't care what happens to Lincoln. Owen looked away. You owe him the truth, she pressed. Owen's jaw tightened. And what do you plan to do, Ivy? March into Lincoln's room and tell him everything? That his wife has been lying to him? That she's been waiting for him to die so she can collect his fortune? Yes, Ivy said without hesitation. Owen let out a bitter chuckle. And you think he'll believe you? Ivy hesitated. Owen sighed. Brooklyn has spent years making sure Lincoln only sees what she wants him to see. She's been patient, careful. She doesn't make mistakes. Ivy's throat tightened. Then I'll find Daniel. Owen blinked. Excuse me? Ivy straightened, her voice stronger now. If Brooklyn has spent years making sure Lincoln never finds his son, then that's exactly what I need to do. Owen shook his head. Ivy, don't... I have an address, she interrupted. It's old, but it's a place to start. Owen's expression darkened. Brooklyn will not let you do this. Ivy's lips parted, ready to argue, but then, a knock at the door. Both of them froze. Owen's gaze flickered to her before he moved toward the door, schooling his expression into something neutral. Ivy stepped back, her hands curling into fists at her sides as Owen pulled it open. Brooklyn stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Doctor, she said smoothly, then let her gaze slide toward Ivy. And Miss Hayes, how lovely to see you both. Ivy forced a tight smile. Brooklyn. Brooklyn's lips curved, but her eyes were cold. You seem to be everywhere these days. Ivy lifted her chin. Just doing my job. Brooklyn let out a soft hum. Funny, because I seem to remember hiring you as a nurse, not a private investigator. Ivy's stomach twisted. but she didn't let it show. Brooklyn stepped inside, walking past them with an air of ownership, like she belonged here more than either of them. She turned to Owen. "We need to talk." Owen exhaled. "Now." Brooklyn's gaze flicked toward Ivy. "Yes. Now." Owen hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Ivy, we're done here." It wasn't a suggestion. Ivy held his gaze, silently willing him to say something, anything. But he didn't. He only moved aside, waiting for her to leave. Fine. Ivy gave Brooklyn one last look before stepping past them and out the door. She didn't stop walking until she reached the back terrace, the cool evening air washing over her like a tidal wave. Her pulse was racing, adrenaline surging through her veins. Brooklyn knew. She wasn't sure how much, but she knew something. And Ivy? She wasn't going to wait around for Brooklyn to make the next move. She was going to find Daniel, even if it meant Brooklyn would come after her next. The night air was thick with humidity, clinging to Ivy's skin as she stood on the back terrace of the Langford estate. The sky was a deep, endless navy, dotted with stars that did nothing to ease the growing unease in her chest. She gripped the cold iron railing, staring out at the vast garden stretching before her. But her mind was somewhere else, on the paper in her pocket, on the name that held the key to everything, Daniel Langford. She had to find him. There was no other way. But Brooklyn was onto her. And Owen had made his choice. He was willing to stand in the middle, doing just enough to keep Lincoln comfortable, but not enough to change anything. That meant Ivy was on her own. She exhaled, trying to calm the rush of adrenaline coursing through her. She needed a plan. She had an address. Old, but it was all she had. If Daniel was still there, she had to reach him before Brooklyn found out what she was up to. Ivy. She stiffened at the sound of her name and turned to find Hugo standing just inside the doorway, his expression unreadable. He rarely sought her out unless it was important. And tonight, she had the distinct feeling this wasn't just about delivering a message from Lincoln. She straightened. "What is it?" Hugo stepped onto the terrace, his hands clasped behind his back. "You need to be careful." Her stomach tightened. "You're the second person to tell me that today. That should tell you something." His tone was even, but there was a warning beneath it. Brooklyn doesn't like when people interfere. Ivy held his gaze. "I'm not interfering. I'm trying to help Lincoln." "And that's exactly what makes you dangerous," Hugo said quietly. Ivy's fingers curled around the railing. "I don't care what Brooklyn wants. Lincoln has a son. He deserves to know." Hugo studied her for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. "If you're going to do this, do it quickly." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing toward the house, as if making sure they were alone. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "Brooklyn is pushing harder. She's speaking with Lincoln's legal team tomorrow." Ivy's stomach turned. "She's trying to take control." Hugo gave a slight nod. "Once everything is finalized, there will be nothing anyone can do. If you want Lincoln to meet his son, you need to make it happen before she locks him away from the truth." Ivy swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her. There wasn't time to hesitate anymore. She had to leave tonight. She met Hugo's gaze. "Will you help me?" A flicker of something crossed his face. Uncertainty, maybe even regret. Then, finally, he nodded. "I'll have a car ready for you within the hour." Relief and apprehension tangled in her chest. This was happening. Hugo took a step back, his expression unreadable. "Be careful, Ivy." She gave him a small nod before he disappeared into the house, leaving her alone with the weight of what she was about to do. The drive was quiet, the roads nearly empty, as Ivy made her way out of Savannah and toward the address she had found in Lincoln's records. The estate, the world of old money and carefully crafted illusions, felt like a distant memory as she passed darkened storefronts and run-down houses. This wasn't the kind of place someone like Brooklyn Langford would ever step foot in. But Daniel Langford wasn't Brooklyn, and that was exactly why Ivy was here. She pulled into the driveway of a small auto shop, the flickering neon sign above the door reading Dawson's Garage. It wasn't much, an old building with a gravel lot, a few rusted cars parked along the side, but something about it felt solid, real in a way that Langford Estate never had. Ivy stepped out of the car, her heart pounding as she approached the entrance. The glass door was locked, the closed sign flipped against the window, but the lights inside were still on. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time. A moment later, she heard the shuffle of footsteps, the sound of a lock turning, and then the door cracked open. A man stood in the doorway, tall with broad shoulders, dark hair slightly tousled, as if he had just run a hand through it. He had the same sharp eyes as Lincoln, but where Lincoln's held the weight of years of regret, his held something harder, a wariness that hadn't yet settled into defeat. Ivy's breath caught. This was him, Daniel Langford. His gaze flickered over her, assessing. "We're closed." Ivy found her voice. "I'm not here for a car." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Then you're in the wrong place." He started to close the door, but Ivy quickly stepped forward, blocking it with her hand. "Wait." Daniel stilled, his eyes narrowing. "Look, lady. I know who you are," Ivy said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "And I know who your father is." That made him pause. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Daniel pushed the door open, just enough to step fully into view, his posture tense. "My father's dead." Ivy swallowed. "Number, he's not." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then he might as well be." Ivy hesitated. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but hearing the resentment in his voice made the weight of it feel heavier. He had spent his life believing Lincoln had abandoned him, because Lincoln had. And now she was standing here, expecting him to listen to a story he had no reason to believe. But she had to try. "Daniel, I know you don't want to hear this," she said carefully. "But Lincoln, he's sick. He doesn't have much time." Daniel's expression remained cold. "So?" Ivy exhaled sharply. "So he's been looking for you?" That hit something. She saw it in the way his fingers twitched, the way his jaw shifted just slightly. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened again. "If that were true, he would have found me a long time ago." Ivy shook her head. "He made mistakes. He regrets them. But if you don't hear him out now, you'll never get the chance." Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "And why do you care?" Ivy hesitated. She could tell him it was just her job, that she was nothing more than a nurse caught in the middle of something bigger than herself. But that wasn't true. Somewhere along the way, this had become more than that. Lincoln wasn't just a patient. He was a man trying to fix the pieces of his broken life before it was too late. She met Daniel's gaze. "Because I believe people deserve second chances." For the first time, something in Daniel's expression wavered. He looked away, exhaling heavily, as if weighing something. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'll think about it." Ivy's shoulders sagged with relief, but she knew better than to push. This was more than she had expected tonight. It was something. And for now, something was enough. The car ride back to Langford Estate was silent, but Ivy's mind was anything but. Daniel's voice echoed in her head, sharp with resentment, laced with something unspoken. "If that were true, he would have found me a long time ago." She gripped the steering wheel tighter, the weight of what she had started pressing into her chest. He hadn't shut her out completely, but he hadn't agreed either. "I'll think about it." That was all she had, and it wasn't enough. Not yet. The towering gates of the estate came into view, looming against the dark sky. As she pulled into the driveway, her headlights illuminated the grand house, its warm golden glow standing in stark contrast to the coldness that lurked inside. The moment she killed the engine, she spotted Hugo waiting for her near the front entrance, his expression carefully neutral. Ivy exhaled and stepped out of the car, bracing herself. "You were gone longer than expected," Hugo murmured as she approached. "I had to be sure." His gaze flickered over her face, assessing. "And?" Ivy hesitated. He didn't say no. Hugo let out a slow breath. "That's better than I expected." She nodded, rubbing her arms against the chill of the night air. "Did anyone notice I was gone?" There was a beat of silence before Hugo's expression darkened slightly. "Brooklyn's been asking for you." Ivy's stomach tightened. "Of course she has." Hugo gave a slow nod. "She's waiting in the parlor." Ivy clenched her jaw. Brooklyn wasn't going to let this go, and she knew it, but she wouldn't run. Not now. Straightening her shoulders, she moved past Hugo and into the house, her steps steady as she made her way down the grand hallway. The parlor doors were already open, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long shadows along the floor. Brooklyn stood near the mantel, a glass of wine in hand, swirling the deep red liquid absently. She didn't look up right away, letting the moment stretch between them, a silent power move that only made Ivy's resolve harden. Finally, Brooklyn turned, her lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. "There you are." Ivy crossed her arms. "You were looking for me?" Brooklyn took a sip of her wine before setting the glass down with a soft clink. "You've been busy?" Ivy didn't blink. "I have a job to do." Brooklyn hummed, stepping closer. "Funny, I don't recall your job description involving unsanctioned road trips." Ivy's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. "I don't need your permission to leave the house." Brooklyn tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. "No, I suppose you don't." She took another step forward, voice lowering. "But you do need to understand your place." Ivy met her gaze, unflinching. "And what place is that?" Brooklyn smirked. "Temporary." The words slithered between them, deliberate and sharp. Ivy inhaled slowly. "If that's true, then why are you so worried about what I'm doing?" Brooklyn's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted, the subtle game of control teetering. "I'm not worried, Ivy," Brooklyn murmured. "I just don't like disruptions." Ivy arched a brow. "You mean the truth?" Brooklyn's lips twitched, her amusement growing. "Truth is relative." Ivy clenched her fists. "Not to Lincoln." Brooklyn exhaled, shaking her head as if Ivy was an unruly child who just didn't understand. "Lincoln is an old man with a failing body and a mind stuck in the past. He doesn't need more confusion. He needs stability." Ivy's throat tightened. "He needs his son." Brooklyn's smile disappeared. Silence settled between them, thick and charged. Ivy took a careful step forward, lowering her voice. "You can't stop this, Brooklyn. He's going to find out." Brooklyn studied her for a long moment, before exhaling softly. "You're awfully confident." Ivy held her ground. "Because I know I'm right." Brooklyn's expression remained unreadable, but something cold flickered in her gaze. "We'll see." Then, just like that, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she disappeared down the hall. Ivy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands shaking at her sides. Brooklyn wasn't backing down, but neither was she. The next morning, Ivy found Lincoln in the study, seated at his desk, staring out the window with a faraway look. The sunlight cast soft shadows across his face, making the lines of his age seem even deeper. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Good morning." Lincoln blinked, as if pulling himself from his thoughts. His lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Ivy." She sat across from him, watching him carefully. "How are you feeling?" Lincoln exhaled. "I've had worse days." There was something in his voice, something heavier than usual. Ivy hesitated, then finally said, "I found him." Lincoln stilled. His fingers tightened around the armrest, his breath just barely hitching. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward her. "Daniel." Ivy nodded. "He's in Savannah. I spoke to him last night." Lincoln didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't move to hide it. "He was surprised," Ivy continued carefully. He didn't believe me at first." Lincoln swallowed hard. "That's understandable." Ivy softened. "But he didn't say no." Lincoln let out a shaky breath, his eyes glassy as he stared past her, as if looking at something she couldn't see. "After all these years," Ivy leaned forward. "You still have time, Lincoln. He still has time." Lincoln was silent for a long moment, his throat working as he tried to compose himself. Finally, he met her gaze, his voice thick. "What do I do now?" Ivy reached across the desk, placing her hand over his. "You ask him to come home." A tear slipped down Lincoln's cheek, but he didn't brush it away. For the first time, there was hope in his eyes, and for the first time, Ivy knew this was worth it. Lincoln's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter Ivy had helped him write. The morning light filtered in through the tall windows of the study, casting a golden glow over the room. But Lincoln's focus was elsewhere. His fingers traced over the name at the top of the page. Daniel Langford. After decades of silence, of regret, of mistakes he could never undo, it all came down to this. A letter, a request, a chance. Ivy watched him carefully, her own heart racing. She had seen the hesitation in his eyes, the deep-rooted fear that lingered beneath the surface. But she also saw something else, hope. "You don't have to send it," she said gently, "but I think you should." Lincoln exhaled, his gaze flickering up to hers. "And if he doesn't respond?" Ivy's throat tightened. "Then at least you'll know you tried." He let out a slow breath and nodded. Then, with deliberate care, he folded the letter and slipped it into the envelope. His hands were unsteady, but his resolve was firm. Before either of them could say another word, a sharp voice cut through the air. "What is that?" Ivy turned just as Brooklyn stepped into the study, her gaze locked onto the envelope in Lincoln's grasp. Her usual polished smile was gone, replaced with something colder, sharper. Lincoln didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully set the letter down on the desk and met Brooklyn's gaze with a calm that sent a chill through Ivy. "A letter to my son," he said simply. Brooklyn's jaw tightened. "There's no need for that." Lincoln's expression didn't waver. "There is." Brooklyn let out a quiet laugh, though it held no humor. "Lincoln, you are not well. You know that. The last thing you need is to stir up the past." Ivy could see it now, the desperation behind Brooklyn's carefully constructed mask. She was losing control, and she knew it. Lincoln straightened slightly, his voice firm. "The past has already been stirred, Brooklyn. I will not leave this world with unfinished business." Brooklyn's smile faded entirely. "This is a mistake." Lincoln's gaze darkened. "Number. The mistake was letting people like you convince me to stay silent for this long." A flicker of something, shock, perhaps, crossed Brooklyn's face, but it was gone in an instant. She inhaled slowly, composing herself. Then she turned her attention to Ivy, her expression unreadable. "This was you, wasn't it?" Ivy didn't back down. Lincoln made his own decision. Brooklyn let out a slow exhale, tapping her manicured fingers against the side of her dress. "You are overstepping, Ivy." Ivy lifted her chin. "I'm doing what's right." Brooklyn's eyes flashed. "What's right?" She let out a small, incredulous laugh before stepping closer. "You think you know this family. You think you know what's best for Lincoln I know he's not a pawn in your game, Ivy shot back. Brooklyn's lips pressed together, but the tension in her posture gave her away. She wasn't used to losing. And now, she was losing control of the one thing she had worked so hard to secure: Lincoln's future. Lincoln's voice cut through the silence. I'll be making arrangements to see Daniel. Brooklyn turned sharply toward him, her composure slipping for the first time. You can't be serious. Lincoln leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Very. Brooklyn stared at him, her throat working as she swallowed back whatever retort she wanted to throw at him. For a moment, the room was thick with silence, the weight of Lincoln's words settling over all of them. Then, slowly, Brooklyn smoothed a hand down the front of her dress, her expression shifting back into something carefully neutral. Well, she said softly, if that's what you want. Ivy's stomach twisted. It was too easy. Brooklyn wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat. Lincoln didn't speak as Brooklyn turned and walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at Ivy. The look in her eyes was a silent promise. This wasn't over. Then she was gone. Lincoln exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He suddenly looked older, more tired, but lighter. She's not going to let this happen without a fight, Ivy murmured. Lincoln nodded. I know. Ivy hesitated, then carefully placed her hand over his. But you're not alone in this. A small, weary smile touched Lincoln's lips. No, he murmured. I suppose I'm not. A knock at the door made them both turn. Hugo stepped inside, his expression as unreadable as ever, but his eyes flickered to Ivy for the briefest moment before he spoke. There's a visitor at the gate, he said simply. Lincoln frowned. At this hour? Hugo nodded. He says his name is Daniel Langford. Ivy's breath caught. Lincoln stilled. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Lincoln let out a shaky breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. Let him in. Hugo nodded once and disappeared down the hall. Ivy turned to Lincoln, searching his expression. His face was pale, his eyes distant, as if his mind was racing through decades of memories all at once. Are you ready for this? Ivy asked softly. Lincoln let out a slow breath. Then, with a quiet certainty, he met her gaze. I have to be. Ivy nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Then, the study doors creaked open. And there he was, Daniel Langford. He stood in the doorway, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered to Ivy first, then slowly to Lincoln. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, Daniel's voice, quiet, rough, edged with something Ivy couldn't quite place, broke the silence. You wanted to see me. Lincoln's breath hitched. He gripped the armrest of his chair, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel. The name was barely a sound, a breath of a word that carried years of regret, of longing, of love that had never been spoken. Daniel's jaw clenched, his throat working as he swallowed. I don't know why I came here, he admitted. Lincoln's eyes glistened. Because you wanted to. Silence. Then, after a long moment, Daniel exhaled, stepping fully into the room. Maybe, he said quietly. And for the first time in years, Lincoln Langford had his son in front of him. The room felt impossibly small, despite the grand size of Lincoln's study. Ivy held her breath, watching the moment unfold between father and son. Two men who had spent a lifetime apart, now standing mere feet from each other, neither knowing what to say. Daniel stood stiffly near the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jeans. He looked out of place here, a stark contrast to the rich mahogany walls and the velvet armchairs, but his presence was undeniable. He wasn't just an outsider stepping into this world. He was the rightful heir to it. Lincoln, still seated, looked up at him as if afraid to blink, afraid that Daniel would disappear if he did. His hands trembled where they rested on the armrests, his breathing uneven. "You came," Lincoln finally said, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shifted on his feet, his jaw tight. "Yeah." Silence. Ivy could see the battle happening inside of him. The part of Daniel that wanted to be here, and the part that wanted to walk right back out that door. The years of resentment, of wondering why his father never came for him, clashed with whatever had made him drive all the way here tonight. Lincoln swallowed hard. "I don't know where to start." Daniel let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "That makes two of us." Lincoln exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I imagine you have questions." Daniel's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Only about 1,000. Lincoln nodded slowly. "And I'll answer every single one, if you'll let me." The weight of those words settled between them. Daniel looked away for a moment, running a hand through his hair before exhaling sharply. "I don't know why I even came here. I told myself for years that if you ever tried to reach me, it'd be too late, that I wouldn't care." His gaze met Lincoln's again, and this time, there was something raw in it. "So why am I here?" Lincoln's throat bobbed as he tried to find his voice. "Because no matter how much time passes, some things still matter." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Like what?" Lincoln's voice was hoarse. "Like a father loving his son." The words hit like a punch to the chest. Daniel's entire body tensed, his lips parting slightly as if caught off guard. He looked away quickly, as if the weight of that sentence was too much to bear. Ivy felt her throat tighten. This was what she'd been waiting for. The moment Lincoln told Daniel the truth. The moment he fought for the relationship he had lost. But Daniel wasn't ready to let it in. He shook his head. "You don't get to say that, not after all these years." Lincoln's face crumbled. "I know." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "To you, because I don't think you do. You don't know what it was like, growing up with nothing, knowing that the man who could have helped me, who could have changed everything, just didn't." Lincoln's eyes filled with something Ivy had only seen in fleeting moments. Guilt. "I was a coward," Lincoln admitted softly. "I should have fought harder. I should have been there." Daniel scoffed. "Yeah, you should have." Silence stretched between them again, heavy and unrelenting. Lincoln let out a shaky breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Daniel. I don't deserve it." Daniel's fists clenched. "Then why call me here?" Lincoln's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Because I'm dying." The words landed like a final blow. Daniel's breath caught. For the first time, his anger faltered. Lincoln swallowed, his hands trembling as he reached up to wipe at his face. "I don't have much time left, and I couldn't—" He inhaled sharply, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I couldn't leave this world without seeing you." Daniel stood there, motionless. Ivy could see the internal battle waging inside of him. The war between anger and grief, between pain and the undeniable truth that no matter how much time had been lost, this was still his father. Finally, Daniel exhaled, his voice quieter this time. "How long?" Lincoln's lips pressed together before he answered. "Months, if I'm lucky." Daniel's throat bobbed as he nodded slowly, as if processing the weight of those words. "And Brooklyn?" Lincoln sighed, his expression tightening. "She doesn't want you here." Daniel huffed out a laugh. "Yeah, I figured." Ivy finally spoke. "That's why you need to stay." Daniel's gaze snapped to hers, as if just remembering she was in the room. He frowned. "And who exactly are you in all this?" Ivy hesitated. She had asked herself that question more than once over the past few weeks. But now, standing here, watching this fractured relationship unfold, She knew the answer. "I'm someone who cares about your father," she said simply. "Someone who wants to see him make things right before it's too late." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. Then finally he exhaled. "I don't know if this can be fixed," he admitted. Lincoln's voice was thick. "I don't either, but I'd like to try." The room fell silent again. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Daniel stepped forward, not much, just enough to close some of the space between them. "Guess we'll see," he murmured. Lincoln's breath hitched. "Guess we will." Ivy felt the tension shift. Not gone, not resolved, but different. This wasn't the perfect reunion Lincoln had probably imagined in his quiet moments of regret, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Langford estate, casting long golden streaks across the library's mahogany floors. The air smelled faintly of aged books and fresh tea, a quiet contrast to the storm that had been brewing in this house for weeks. Lincoln sat in his chair by the fireplace, his breathing slow, deliberate. He looked tired, more so than Ivy had ever seen him, but there was something different in his expression. Peace. Daniel stood across from him, hands shoved into his pockets, the tension in his shoulders not quite gone but softened. The anger had lessened, but the wounds of the past still lingered between them, unspoken. Ivy sat nearby, watching carefully, knowing this was Lincoln's moment. "I had a dream last night," Lincoln murmured, breaking the silence. His voice was weaker now, as if each word required effort. "I saw Rose. She was laughing, running through the gardens the way she used to when she was little." Daniel's jaw tensed at the mention of his half-sister. He had barely spoken about her since arriving. Lincoln sighed, staring into the fireplace. "I wasted so much time, thinking I could make up for the past later. And now here I am, running out of later." Daniel shifted, exhaling slowly. "You're not the only one who lost time." Lincoln's eyes flickered towards him, something unreadable in his gaze. "Number, I suppose not." A long silence stretched between them. Ivy's throat tightened. This was it, the moment that would define whether all of this had been worth it. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I don't know how to forgive you." Lincoln nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "I don't know how to ask you to." Daniel let out a breath. "So where does that leave us?" Lincoln's lips twitched into something small, tired. "Maybe it leaves us here, trying." Daniel stared at him for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Lincoln let out a breath he had probably been holding for years. From the corner of the room, Brooklyn appeared, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorway. "This is touching," she mused, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Truly." Daniel turned to her, unimpressed. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Brooklyn smirked. "Well, I couldn't let all of Lincoln's newfound clarity get in the way of his best interests." Ivy stiffened. She had been waiting for Brooklyn's next move. She had known it was coming. Lincoln, however, looked almost amused. "Brooklyn, you always were good at waiting for the perfect moment to interfere." She smiled. "And yet I'm always the one left cleaning up your messes." Her gaze flickered toward Daniel, cool and detached. "I assume you're staying?" Daniel didn't flinch. "You assume right." Brooklyn sighed, shaking her head. "You've been here for less than a week, and already Lincoln's rewriting everything. How convenient." Lincoln let out a slow breath. "Actually, I've already spoken to my lawyers." Brooklyn's smile wavered. "Excuse me?" Lincoln's gaze never left hers. "I changed my will this morning." Silence fell over the room. Ivy's heart pounded. Brooklyn's mask didn't crack, but Ivy saw the way her fingers curled slightly, nails pressing into her palms. "Lincoln, darling," she said smoothly, You're not well. You shouldn't be making rash decisions. This isn't rash, Lincoln interrupted, his voice calm but firm. It's right. Brooklyn stared at him. For the first time since Ivy had arrived at this house, Lincoln Langford looked completely in control. I won't leave this world with regrets, Lincoln said softly, and I certainly won't leave it in your hands. Brooklyn let out a slow breath, collecting herself before plastering on another false smile. Well, she murmured, smoothing her dress, I suppose that settles things then? She turned, heading for the door, pausing just long enough to glance at Ivy. A silent warning. Then she was gone. Lincoln exhaled, his body sagging slightly, as if releasing a weight he had carried for too long. Daniel let out a breath. That was something? Lincoln chuckled weakly. It was overdue. Ivy felt a small smile tug at her lips. How do you feel? Lincoln looked at her, his tired eyes shining with something bittersweet. Ready. Ivy's chest ached. She knew what he meant. He had made peace with his past, with Daniel, with himself. And now his time was running out. The days that followed were quiet. Daniel stayed, not because he had fully forgiven Lincoln, but because something inside him knew this was time he would never get back. He sat with his father on the terrace, listened to his stories, learned about the man he had spent his life resenting. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Ivy remained too, though she knew she wouldn't be here much longer. Her job was never meant to last. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Lincoln called for Ivy. She found him in the sunroom, a soft breeze drifting through the open windows. He looked peaceful, a book resting on his lap, though she wasn't sure he had been reading. She sat beside him. You asked for me? Lincoln turned his head toward her, his smile warm but weak. I wanted to thank you. Ivy's throat tightened. You don't have to. But I do. He studied her, eyes filled with something she wasn't sure she deserved. I didn't think I had any time left for redemption, but you gave me a second chance. Ivy swallowed past the lump in her throat. It wasn't me, Lincoln. It was you. He chuckled softly. You're kind, Ivy. You should let people see that more often. She let out a small laugh, blinking back tears. I'll work on it. Lincoln exhaled, his gaze drifting to the garden outside. I think I'll rest now. Ivy squeezed his hand gently. Okay. She stayed until his breathing evened out, until the steady rise and fall of his chest lulled into something peaceful. And when Daniel stepped in a few minutes later, taking the chair beside his father, Ivy knew it was time to go. She slipped out quietly, her heart full, her purpose complete. Lincoln Langford had found peace, and Ivy had found something too, a reason to believe in second chances.